Hey, Anchor community, Pastor Bryan here. So glad to be with you as we continue our teaching series through Ephesians. And today we're talking about how to change. Like, how do we experience, how do we see change in our lives? And to do that, we're going to be looking at Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 all the way to 32. I'm going to be reading verses 17 to 24 because this is the focal point, really, of Paul's argument, and I want us to draw special attention to it. But I want you to have your Bibles open all to that section of chapter 4, verses 17 to 32, as it really impacts the whole argument at length. So starting in verse 17, Paul says, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord." Paul is saying, I'm not just like pleading or asking, or I'm not just begging you, I'm like insisting. I'm taking the authority I have as a pastor and insisting that you consider, that you remember, that you draw this to attention. And in the Lord, not just by his own authority, but by God's authority, he's insisting on it, that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do. Now, they were Gentiles. So what does that mean? And Paul's saying, hey, there's a way of living life that is apart from the family of God. And Paul's using a shorthand of Gentiles to explain that. As the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking, they are darkened in their understanding and separated from the life of God because of the ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts. Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity, and they are full of greed. Verse 20 says, "That, however, is not the way of life you learned when you heard about Christ and were taught." So you learned and were taught in accordance, or in him in accordance with the truth that is in Jesus. You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off the old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So we're going to talk about how to change. There's going to be three sections, three parts of this talk. The first is deep change, big need, bigger God. Deep change, big need, bigger God. To do that, I want to start talking about deep change. I want to look back at this verse, starting in verse 22. Paul says, you were taught, right? I communicated these things. You were educated with regard to the former way of life to put off the old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Paul is using this language of putting off and putting on, and it comes from, in the Greek idiom, like clothing. Putting on certain clothing, taking off certain clothing. This is like how the Ephesians would have understood what Paul was talking about. He's using a metaphor of clothing. He's talking about a total wardrobe change of the heart. I remember years ago, Candace and I would watch this show, What Not to Wear. Admittedly, there are shows that if you're a spouse or if you're in a romantic relationship, you watch certain shows that you wouldn't watch by yourself. And there's, of course, certain shows that you watch when your partner isn't around. I watch Kung Fu movies. But together at this part of our, stage, Candace wanted to watch What Not to Wear. So I went along with it, and I oftentimes enjoyed it. But the premise is of a spouse or partner or friend points out a person that needs desperate help in their wardrobe. And Clinton and Stacy come and assist a total wardrobe overhaul. Paul is talking about this deep level of change, not just in the wardrobe, but in the heart. And this language of using this metaphor of like transformation was common to use in the first century. The Ephesians would be very familiar with people saying, put off impatience, put on patience, put on mean-spiritedness, or put off mean-spiritedness, put on kindness. They would have been very familiar with this language of taking off certain like bad practices, bad attitudes, and putting on other good practices and good attitudes. But what they were not familiar with was how Paul was using it. Paul was not talking about just certain virtues, like taking off a virtue, taking off, putting on something else, changing parts of your life. He was talking about all of your life. Take off your old self, put on your new self. Paul is being sweeping in his call to what real change looks like. Deep change requires not just changing an aspect of yourself, but your entire self, which is kind of mind-boggling if we were to just spend a time thinking about it. Like, think about what's all involved in yourself. All the complex parts of who you are. You could think of like your finances, and then the job you do to get your finances, to pay your bills. And you see all these things are tied together with other things, relationships, who you want to be with, but sometimes can't. Maybe that's a grandparent right now. Maybe that's a grandchild because of this season. Who you want to be with, but you can't. Who you want to be with, but you are, and you make a priority of doing it, whatever the cost. Who you don't want to be with, but you end up being with them. This is all part of the self, how we spend our time, what's on our iCal calendar or Google calendar. What does our thought life look like? Where do our thoughts go when no one is around? What are the things that keep us up at night? These are all parts of yourself, like who you are. And Paul is saying it's not just virtues that need to change. It's not just that you need to become more patient or you need to become more kind. It's that your whole self, the wardrobe of yourself needs to change. How does that happen? Like, how does one's self change? Societies and people have experimented with how to do this throughout time. How does the self change? Some have used what you could call social conformity to bring about a change to the self. For instance, communist Russia, when they outlawed religion, all of a sudden religion was not something that was allowed. And so there was this sense of trying to change the nation and the citizens in the nation by social conformity. Do as we say, we're imposing it upon you. But the problem is that what often happens because of social conformity as a means to change the self is just building up resentment and eventual revolution, right? Or resistance. In fact, one of the interesting things with communist Russia is that even though religion was outlawed, Russian Orthodox icons were just hid in basements and closets. And the second communist Russia fell, all of a sudden they were brought back out again. Oh, it looks like we never really changed. Some people grow up in religious environments like this, where there's a level of social conformity, do as we do or else. And so they end up leaving that religious environment, believing that to be freedom, escape from that level of social conformity. But they end up falling into another thing that really is just another mode of social conformity or whatever. They're freed from one thing, but they're enslaved to another. Then apart from social conformity, there's social conditioning. As a college pastor, I saw many college students who grew up in a Christian home, a loving Christian home, come in, and all of a sudden what happened to their faith, it seemed like it was gone because of the social environment that held it together was no longer there. I personally came to faith when I was a senior in high school, came to trust in Jesus when I was a senior in high school. And I remember 2 years into college, I had a retreat with some friends. And we were asking this question. Everybody got asked this question: how is your walk with Jesus? And we had time to kind of share that. And people could ask any question they wanted of us when we were elaborating on how our walk with Jesus was. And I remember one person there on that trip, a close friend, when asked, how was your walk with Jesus? And it was this focused time of people sharing, transparency, vulnerability. He broke down and said, I cannot imagine my faith with Jesus without you. You are my faith with Jesus. And so I don't have a faith because I'm not with you anymore. And it was at some time, in part, endearing as we had such a powerful role in his life, but also heartbreaking as he could not imagine a faith with Jesus apart from a certain group of friends at a certain time. The Welsh pastor Martin Lloyd-Jones says, "Many have been overshadowed by the presence of God. Fewer have been pierced by the power of God." My friend had experienced this beautiful part of community, the Christian community, but it hadn't penetrated the deep down layers. His self was still not changed in a deep, profound way that he may have even hungered for. Still others try to change the self with personal willpower. But when you think about changing the self, all the parts of who we are, oftentimes the willpower is able to change one aspect of ourselves. Lose some weight, work on our budget, do some work in emotional health, but it doesn't affect the whole self. Personal willpower, social conditioning, social conformity, they've been tried on and on throughout time, throughout societies and families, by individuals, but they lack the power to change the entire self, to do as what Paul is asking of put off the old self, take on the new self. It lacks the ability to do that. And when you think about the power mechanisms at play within social conformity, social conditioning, and willpower, really it boils down to just pride and shame. You're proud of yourself for adhering to the group identity or for muscling through some willpower. And that's a powerful mechanism for change for a period of time. Or you're feeling shamed, and so you're conforming because you're ashamed of not looking like the group. So you try to conform like them out of a desire, out of a really shameful motivation. Both of these things work for a period of time, but they don't affect the deep core of who we are. And they only have the shelf life as far as how much change they actually bring. So how do we really change the self? How do we do what Paul is saying the Ephesians need to do? Put off old, take on new. How does that happen? Well, it begins by recognizing not just the depth of change, but the big need that we all have. Paul says in verse 22, says, "You were taught with regard to your former way of life to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires." Paul says there's this old self is being corrupted by deceitful desires. So Paul's saying there, it's not like at the point that you heard the message of Jesus when your life changed, it's not like you were as bad as you possibly could be, but there's this sense of, apart from that transforming work of Jesus, there's this consistent, constant corruption according to our desires that take us down all sorts of rabbit holes that are not necessarily completely healthy, sometimes incredibly unhealthy. So there's this constant corruption that is happening to our old self. And he unpacks it with stark realism in verses 17 to 19, where he says, "So I tell you this and insist on it in the Lord," like we read at the very beginning, "that you must no longer live as the Gentiles do in the futility of their thinking. They're darkened in their understanding, separated from the life of God because of their ignorance that is in them due to the hardening of their hearts." And then he says, "Having lost all sensitivity, they have given themselves over to sensuality, so as to indulge in every kind of impurity. They're full of greed." Paul is saying here they're darkened in their understanding, in their way of thinking, in their brain, in their mind, in their capacity to understand, to reason. There's a brokenness in the mind. And there is a hardening in their heart. There's a lack of ability to feel, to sense the beauty and the power and the love of God. And there is a lack of feeling with regards to their experience. They've lost all sensitivity. Paul's saying they're unable. There's this deep, big, great need at the center of humanity, Paul is suggesting. And the interesting thing is that oftentimes we think that this is freedom. In verse 19, but like the idea of sensuality is culturally identified as freedom. Giving into your sensual desires is often portrayed as freedom. Paul calls it slavery. You've given yourself over, which means you've given control over to your sensuality, which means that you're really you're enslaved to whatever you desire at the moment. Paul is saying that this is the natural state of humanity. This deep level of brokenness, which, if you were like me before I became a follower of Jesus, you might be saying, come on, really? Why so bleak, Paul? Let me tell you, I was talking to a friend recently, and he said something profound. He didn't realize it was profound. I think it's profound. He said, Bryan, it's easy to believe that seasonal affective disorder doesn't exist, but then you experience 60 degrees and sun, and you realize that, oh my gosh, it does. You realize what a little bit of sun does, and you recognize the fog that you were in for the months before. The same thing goes with regards to understanding Jesus. You think that this is freedom, that this is great, that this is okay, but then you experience something you have not experienced, and it opens up doors, windows, feeling, sense that you didn't know was even there. So to anyone suggesting, come on, why so bleak? Can I just tell you that there's more that you have yet to experience that would make the world's vision of freedom look like the slavery that it is? I remember I was in a high school world religions class. It was awesome being in a public school that have a class on world religions. I don't think it's very common, and the teacher did a fantastic job. And I was not a follower of Jesus at that point, but I remember towards the end of the class, the teacher asked a simple question after learning about Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and all the other main religions of the world. So what is wrong with the world? And it was an open class discussion. We talked about the vision of the world from all these different religions and what the problem was in Buddhism and Hinduism. There's this gulf between enlightenment or the divine and the self. And so over periods of lifetime, you work off your karma to eventually get to that point of enlightenment. In Judaism and Islam, there's this sense of a weakened self that needs the assistance of God and a moral system to accomplish what was considered righteous. And I remember as we started talking about Christianity, some people talked about certain varieties of sin, worse and better, and okay sins and not okay sins. We were all talking and exploring the question of what is wrong with the world. And in a moment of maybe unpredicted brilliance on my part, often I don't share stories where I do it right here. And I don't know how I got this answer. Probably somebody had told me this, but I raised my hand and I said, it's almost like the problem of the world is not the sins we do, but that it's like we have this state of sin that we're living in. And that the bad things that we do just come from this inner corruption that needs to be healed. And it was like all the Christians in the class were looking at me saying, I agree with Bryan on that one. I agree with Bryan. Because this is, of course, is the Paul's perspective. This is the biblical perspective on what sin is. That it's not something, the problem of the world is not something to hurdle through our own effort, but it's a problem at the center of ourself. Think about it. Think about how, the ability we have to turn beautiful things, good things like sex and work and friendship, into things that are incredibly harmful and toxic and problematic and cause generations of pain. And how easy it is for us to cause sweeping levels of pain. How it's our natural propensity to unchecked cause systems of pain, whether it's racism or familial. I mean, the options are endless and how it comes just so naturally for us. To experience the change that Paul is talking about, we have to come face to face with the need that we all have. We can't write it off. We can't rationalize it. We can't minimize it. We have to come face to face with the real need. But the beautiful thing is it doesn't have to stop there. We not only come face to face with the big need, we then come face to face with the bigger God. In fact, you could say this is like the gospel, the message of Jesus, brings deep inward change. The world brings momentary pride and shame-based change, but the gospel, the message of Jesus, brings deep inward change. Check out verse 23. It says, to be made new. That's Paul's language. To be made new. In verse 23. To be made new. And this is in the Greek, the present infinitive, meaning that there's this constant thing that's happening. You're to be constantly being made new, and it's also passive. And so it's something that is more happening to you rather than something that you are actively doing. The great Paul is saying is that when you encounter not just your need, but you encounter God, the bigger God, the God that is bigger than your need, he is consistently making you new in ways that you don't have the capacity to do. So the way we experience change, the way true change is experienced is that we just recognize our need and cast ourselves upon the King. We recognize our need and cast ourselves upon the King. C.S. Lewis has this brilliant quote that illustrates this, where when we invite God into our life, oftentimes we think he's renovating a cottage, but he's demolishing it to build a palace of which he can live in. This is what Paul is talking about. So he's not God's not adding on a room. He's not putting on a new roof. He's not cleaning up the floor, making it a little bit more hospitable. He's demolishing it. He's bringing it down to the foundation. He's taking it past studs and beams and taking all of it down to the foundation. Why? So he can leave it unbuilt, demolished? No, so he can build it more beautiful. He's not renovating a cottage. He's building a palace that he can live in. In your life, we recognize this. And in verse 24, so 23 is saying it's something that God does in you. Consistently, constantly, he's working on it. It's happening to you. But then in verse 24, there's an active piece that we play. Put on the new self. Put on the new self. Created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. So there's a sense of like we have to recognize our need and just simply cast ourselves upon the King. But then there's a thing that we do. We put on the new self. So the new heart, the thing that God works in us, this new heart that God changes, this cottage turned palace that God changes, begins to show up in our life through new desires. And then we put on the new self, the new practices, new actions that come in some ways naturally from the thing that God has done within us as we've cast ourselves before him in our need. And that, in fact, up to verse 32, this is what Paul's talking about. Don't let any unwholesome thing come from your mouth. Forgive one another. Don't be angry, right? These are all things that come naturally from the new self. You see, the world says, don't be angry. Come on, forgive each other, and lists all these virtues, but it doesn't give us the power. Paul's saying, no, the power comes through the change that God brings, and then we forgive. And then we put on the new self, and we don't let any unwholesome talk come from our mouth. And then anger can be something that we take a breath and get over as we are aware of the God who has transformed us and is working within us in ways that we're aware of and not aware of. So how do we make this something that happening constantly, that is like that like how do we bring all of the active component to facilitate change? How do we step into the change with all of our capacity to do so? Recognizing that we're limited. A major part of our change just simply comes by recognizing our need and coming before God empty-handed. Recognizing that we are limited in our ability to facilitate change. How do we maximize the part that we have to play? Well, interestingly enough, it comes from making Jesus the object of our focus day in and day out. Paying attention. Making him the object of our attention. Quasars, you may know about quasars. Quasars, they're 100 times more luminous than the Milky Way. There's numbers of them in the universe. These beautiful things, they look like a firework, 1,000 fireworks cracked open at the edges of the universe. And scientists, even some believe that they're somehow mysteriously linked between black holes sucking in energy, quasars emitting energy. They put more energy out than 1,000 times the sun in a day. They put more mass out than 600 Earths each day. And here's the thing, is that Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 says, Jesus holds all of creation together by the word of his power. Quasars, these things that emit more energy than 1,000 suns in a day, they're just one part of the world that God holds together with the word of his power. It's a faint fingerprint of God's power. This thing that seems so incredibly massive is a faint fingerprint of God's power. Who is worthy? Who is worthy? So we make the bigness of God our attention. We set our hearts on the bigness of God, but this bigness of God is also expressed in smallness, because not only does he hold all things together by the word of his power, but he became so small. Paul says to take off the old self and put on the new self. Do you know that in a sense he did the opposite for us? Where he took off his rightful, unblemished, eternally present, happy with the Trinity. He took off that self. And yes, was born among us, but then ultimately he put on our self, our brokenness, our pain, our sin on the cross. He became incredibly small, taking on your broken self on the cross, so that you might have the ability to take off the old self and put on the new self. The God who holds quasars with a finger stretched his arms out wide so that you could come near. The poet William Cooper says, "To see the law in Christ fulfilled and to hear his pardoning voice, it transforms a slave into a child and duty into choice." To see the law, to see everything that you wanted to do, that you knew that you needed to do, that you also knew you couldn't in any way do. To see the law in Christ fulfilled, he did it. And to hear his pardoning voice, he didn't hold it over you. Look what I had to do for you. No, his voice is pardoning. To hear his pardoning voice, it transforms a slave, one beholden to shame, guilt, the ways of this world, sensuality, moral conformity. It transforms a slave into a child and duty into choice. Do you know that is an opportunity for you today to begin the process of experiencing real change? Maybe you've been around the church for a while. Maybe you're familiar with scriptures. Maybe you know more than me, but you haven't experienced that real change. Maybe you've been far from God. Maybe you've wondered and doubted and you found yourself watching this online because somebody shared it or you found it somehow. Do you know that real change is offered to you? It's offered to you. Simply take stock of your big need. Not the big need that is only yours, but the big need that is common to humanity. Take stock of it and cast yourself before the King. Say, God, my need is big, but you are bigger. And that simple motion towards God with an open heart can be the first step towards real change.